All right, folks, how are we doing? Sorry I got a late start catching up. But everybody having a good Monday so far?
Been good so far?
Nice. I went through and unloaded some concrete this morning. So keep me all jacked up. You just sort of ready to rock and roll. So you guys, so don't even try and tangle with me because I'm throwing concrete around this morning. Go poorly for you. All right.
Go badly for your computer, though.
What's that?
Maybe it'll go badly for your computer, though, since it's a little far between you and I.
Where are you at, Cade?
Other side of the states. I'm near Big Piney, or
Okay.
Dale.
Okay, you're up by Piney? All right, cool. Nice. Well, I won't try and get into a tussle with my computer. That probably wouldn't be an effective strategy for much of anything. So, all right, cool. How's everybody doing? Questions, concerns about where we're headed, what we got going on, anything along those lines? No? Doing all right? Okay. So, pre-screener went through, took a look. We got almost about 80% of people went through, completed the pre-screener, so that's good. So now if you got an account for research, make sure that you're monitoring that. Some of you are already gotten through like as much as 6 credits already. Nice work if you're already all over that and racking up hours. You've got till the end of the semester to get, remember, 6 is required. But you can go all the way up to 9 if you want to. I'll give you credit. I'll credit you up to 9 for extra credit stuff. But you'll start to see studies pop up on Sona. So make sure that you're going through, taking a look at those. Sign up for those ones that you're interested in. If you have any questions about whether you're eligible, there's always going to be a contact name on those studies. So just reach out. Talk to people and just see, and then again, just start accumulating those. Make sure to monitor Sona so that you're not missing any appointments. But if you're doing that, you've got that stuff made in the shade. And again, a lot of you have already made quite a bit of progress in that area, so that's good. Okay, Samantha, are you out there in the universe?
Yes. Hi.
You want to tell people about SI stuff?
Yeah. So we have SI session again tonight at 6:30. And I have the worksheet posted both under the files in Dr. Class and in the YO group under the modules. So it's at 6:30 tonight, and I look forward to seeing everyone.
Cool. So again, always start studying for these and getting prepped for our quizzes early as opposed to later. We'll talk about this. The more you can spread this out as opposed to cramming at the very end, it just helps you solidify information and hold on to it. So attending sort of these mid-quiz SI sessions are going to be good. Make sure that you're reading the modules, taking notes, and if you do that, you should be in pretty good shape. Okay, cool. All right. We'll jump back into materials. So last time we finished up talking about sort of behavioral genetics, right? And from a classic standpoint, remember, we're thinking about variability or differences within a population on some trait. Let's say it's height, intelligence, anger, extroversion, depression, sort of anything we want. Thinking about this from a classics behavioral genetics standpoint as a function of heritability, genetics, sort of right, what's going on, a shared environment and a unique environment. Okay, and then we went through our different studies, talked about how these different studies have different strengths, and being able to tease some of these pieces in these aspects apart, and then how other studies then sort of build on and sort of help tease other stuff apart. So strengths and weaknesses there. We talked about, based on our research, that classic behavioral genetics research, starting to look at rates of heritability across different types of characteristics, just to give you an example of some of this stuff. But what people were starting to allude to last time, and what we sort of get to now, are some advancements. Again, the original sort of conceptualization of genetic influences, I've got this genetic influence, and then the shared environment that I have within my family is going to add an influence, and then my unique experiences is going to add some more stuff. But as we start to get sort of more and more deep into this, we get different sort of subfields in this area, different areas of study. One is area of molecular genetics. Okay, molecular genetics is going to be people who study the structure and function of individual genes. Okay, so if you say, like, and you've heard this before, Beck, oh, we found the gene for alcoholism. Okay, there's a lot of stuff wrong with that statement. But what it probably means is through some research, folks doing some molecular genetic stuff has isolated a specific gene that appears to be more common in individuals who struggle with alcohol use disorders than people who don't, right? And so if I'm talking about molecular genetics, this is straight up basic science, sort of looking at the individual structure of genes and trying to identify what different genes do. And McKinsey's very excited. Molecular genetics, hooray! Well, this is what McKinsey will be doing. Oh, I'm sorry, that was just to me privately. I just blew up your spot. Never mind, ignore that piece. But it is very exciting, very interesting. Sort of going to go through and identify what specific proteins are being coded by individual genes, and so sort of very like hard science stuff there. Okay, but now the criticism of molecular genetics is that no behavior, no complex psychological process is going to be singly determined at the genetic level. There's never going to be a thing like again, the alcohol gene, like, oh, this is the gene. The single gene that switches on and either determines whether or not you are at risk for alcoholism or not, right? And so molecular genetics starts to get more complex because we were looking at different collections of genes and sort of trying to understand how, one, they're related, and then two, sort of what types of things that they're doing that might increase risk for certain disorders or certain characteristics, which has been pretty cool because then we can try and say, okay, well, if this gene does this thing or codes for this protein, how is that protein involved in the process of stuff? But it gets reduced down or overly simplified, but this is an idea behind molecular genetics. We also have the study of epigenetics, okay? And we're talking about epigenetics, we're talking about the study of environmental factors on the expression of certain genes, all right? Now, we had talked about before sort of this classic genetics, shared environment, unique environment. Well, we start to understand when we get into this more, recognizing that certain genes, certain environmental factors will turn on and off and determine the expression of individual genes, okay? And we had talked about this at the end of class last time. If we think about animal coats in the wintertime versus the summertime, if you think about rabbits, right? During the summer, you got brown rabbits because they've got the genes to code for brown, dark hairs to help them camouflage in. But being a brown rabbit in the middle of a snowstorm isn't a great thing, right? And so what there are also coded in there is an expression of hair color that's triggered by environmental factors that switches that hair from brown to white, okay? And this would be an example of a situation where my environment is influencing how my genes are expressing and sort of what type of things are going on, okay? So again, we've got the idea of this additive model where we've got just genes and then shared environment and unique environment is not actually how things work, right? What we have is we have certain genes that are dependent on the environment to determine whether they're switched on or off. And so what we do is we get an interaction between genes and environment where they're dependent on one another, right? And so again, when we start to get into this nature versus nurture idea, it isn't overly useful because it's not a good way to think about things, okay? Because it's not nature or nurture, it's the combination of these two, right? So maybe I have a genetic potential, or I have coded genes for that would sort of lead to maybe higher levels of intelligence or capability or things along those lines. But if I'm in an environment where those genes aren't allowed to express, if I'm exposed to toxins and stress and things along those lines, maybe sort of my intellectual capability is capped below what it could be just because of, so I don't have the proper environmental influences here. Okay. So when we're thinking about environmental factors that can start to influence genes, we're generally thinking about things like nutrition, okay, drugs, stressors, toxins that can start to impact the expression of certain genes, okay? And this starts to help explain the effect of unique environment, right? Because if I have an identical twin, right, and we both have the same vulnerability for something, my genetic clone may have that trait or that characteristic. I may not. And what it may be is some unique influence that I was exposed to or they weren't, has manipulated the expression of certain genes, either turn things on or off. Okay. And so this helps in psychology when we're in clinical area talking about stress diathesis models. Okay. And again, the same idea we talked about before. I think I got it here. Genetics load the gun, environment pulls the trigger. I can have certain vulnerabilities. I may have a family history of depression, right? And so I may be at greater risk for depression, but I may never actually struggle with depression because even though I have the genes and capability that could put me at greater risk, if I'm not exposed to the certain environmental factors that don't turn those genes on or activate those things, I might not ever experience some of those symptoms. Okay, so again, the idea is that from standpoint of behavior psychology, this is just an incredibly complex system, a lot of inner working parts, and so recognizing that epigenetics, the classic behavioral genetics was great, helping us kind of think about heritability and differentiating heritability of certain characteristics, traits, and things along those lines. When we get down in the nitty gritty, it looks like it's more of an interactive process, right? So I have genes and I have my environment, and if those two things come together in the right way, then we start to get certain expression of stuff. Okay. All right. That was kind of a long sort of pulling all this stuff together. Questions about the concept of genetic or behavioral genetics, epigenetics, stuff like that. Yeah.
So can it be any factors or is it mostly just natural factors?
Can you say a little bit more on that, Colin?
So is it only certain chemical factors that would be seen naturally, or can it be any factor at all?
Yeah, and that's the question, right? And that's where people who work in these areas, right, are trying to identify. And this is where some of the classic behavioral genetics things work, right? So I've got let's say identical twins, and so we have some who have concordance on whatever trait we're looking at, some don't, and then it's trying to go down through and look and are we seeing any patterns for the people where we do see concordance? Are there things that they all shared, and when we've got looking at the pairs who are not concordant, do we see that one had some group of factors and the other one doesn't? A lot of this, and it's really unsatisfying, is that we just don't know. But if you're interested in this stuff, huge opportunities as we continue to go through and take a look. So we can't say for example, lead, right? I've got a heavy metal toxin in my body that then activates certain things, and then trying to say, okay, was it the lead or was it vulnerability? Not everybody who eats lead is going to have the exact same maybe risk, and trying to tease out, okay, how much is the genetic piece of it? How much is the toxin or something along those lines, right? We know, or we think, that things like physical toxins, right? Like introducing lead into your body is not something that hopefully normally is going on, right? So that would be maybe an external man-made type of thing. But then also diet, stress, things along those lines, really intensely impactful events, right? One of the things we'll talk about in terms of depression, we know that the majority of first episodes of depression it's not uncommon for first episodes of depression to be triggered by some event, right? I lost someone or something happened. I was exposed to a pretty intense stressor that maybe activated that depression. But then subsequent episodes of depression, much more likely to be just nothing happens, right? nothing. I can't point to a thing that caused me to be depressed. I just slipped into a bout of depression, right? And so we're thinking about early on, sort of initial episodes, having some sort of external stressor or something like that. But then once that gets going, later ones less involved with that. So it's just super. It's a really cool area, but we don't have a lot of strong answers where I can say, okay, for this thing, these are the factors that turn this gene on, which then cause X, Y, or Z. We're not at that level of precision yet. Does that help, Colin? Cool. Other questions about this stuff? Feeling good? Okay. Cool. So last thing we're going to talk about is an area of psychology known as evolutionary psychology. Okay, evolutionary psychology, you can kind of think about evolutionary psychology as kind of a spin-off or similar to old school functionalism. Like no one today identifies as a functionalist because that was sort of a period or a movement sort of in prehistory. But evolutionary psychology is kind of the current sort of offspring of sort of a hardcore functionalism approach, examining cognition, behavior, emotional adaptations in human or emotional processes in humans as adaptations to the environment, right? So if I'm an evolutionary psychologist, I would say what speech, language, cognition, thinking, feelings, emotion, interpersonal relationships, these are things that are universal in the human species. And so as a consequence of that, we're going to think about these as adaptations to the natural environment. These are things that have evolved to help us survive, perpetuate the species, and things along these lines. Okay. And so if we're thinking about natural selection, some basic components of natural selection. Natural selection assumes one, individuals within a population compete for survival. Basic assumption of natural selection is we're all sort of fighting against each other, right? And it's a zero-sum game. If I win, someone else has to lose, right? And part of this is a competition, an assumption of competition for limited resources. Why does natural selection require there to be limited resources?
To give them something to actually compete for.
Yeah. Kevin, you're exactly right. If there's enough for everybody, if everybody has enough food, if everybody has enough water, if everybody has enough protection from danger, if everybody has an appropriate number or the same number of desirable mates, there's no reason for competition because everybody's got enough, right? And there's no reason for adaptation. But if we're assuming that there's more of us than there are resources to have, then we've got competition, right? And if that's the case, differences in physiology and behavior across individuals is going to start to impact survival and reproductive success. Okay, and what on the genetic level, this is assuming that differences. Again, if you see variability, it just means differences. So that differences across individuals are determined by the expression of certain alleles, right? And then gene mutations. So maybe we've got sort of a cold, nasty world out there. There's only so much food. There's only so many mates. There's only so much sort of ways we can protect ourselves from danger. And the idea is that if we're in competition for these things, some people are going to have certain types of traits that are impacted by sort of expression of alleles or certain mutations that are adaptive. And something about that gene mutation, sort of it's a difference in a gene. It's sort of just something that's kind of happened at random, but it turns out that random mutation of that gene confers some characteristic that makes me better at getting resources than someone else. Okay, so let's say we're all out living in the woods competing for resources, but I've got a gene that makes me just a little more baseline aggressive than other people, right? And so maybe what happens is I fight harder or more fiercely, or am fine with just taking things from other people because of this mutation that sort of resulted in a higher level of aggression, which increases the likelihood of me finding food, surviving, sort of fighting off danger, finding mates and things along those lines. And so that's productive, okay? But maybe I have this gene that sort of confers for higher levels of aggression on average, And because of that, everybody else thinks I'm a jerk and no one wants to work with me or share anything with me or help me out. And so that mutation for increased aggression actually isn't helpful. It's maladaptive. And so what ends up happening then is I'm less likely to get food. I'm less likely to be protected from danger. I'm less likely to get a mate. And so it's less likely for my gene mutation to carry on. Okay. And so again, within the natural selection model, we're assuming that individuals that are better fit for survival, more likely to reproduce, pass along genes. If I'm alive for all of like 3 minutes because I can't see and I get eaten by something real fast, my opportunity to mate and pass along my bad vision genes is limited, right? But if, let's say, there's not food on the ground and I got a super long neck, longer necks than everybody else, and everybody laughs at me, ha ha ha, long neck guy, but I'm able to eat food out of the tree that no one else can get, well, guess what? You're going to starve to death, and then I'm going to get to sort of pick mates and perpetuate my long neck genes, right? And so we start to see transmission of characteristics there. And so what we see is that reproductive success resulting in increased occurrence of adaptive traits that start to become more and more common within a population. Okay, so this is the basic sort of principles or assumptions that natural selection is based on, and then evolutionary psychologists have taken this and tried to use this model to understand aspects of human behavior, why we are the way we are, why people do the things that they do. Okay, oops.
Dr. Clapp,
Yes.
would you go back? Oh.
There we go. All right. Did you get that, Michael? Okay. Cool. So this is the approach of evolutionary psychology. And when we're thinking about sort of this approach, when we look at genetics and sort of how things are going, we see that in all the differences we see in human population, at the genetic level, no more than about 5% attributable average differences across racial and ethnic groups. Okay, and this is surprising, right? If I'm looking at some sort of natives of Wyoming and say natives of say the Philippines, right? I was born in Wyoming, and I'm talking with someone who was born in the Philippines. We're going to look very different probably in terms of just sort of outside characteristics. But at the genetic level, only about 5% of average differences occurring across different groups. And what we see is the majority of variability at the genetic level occurring within a given population. Okay? And so what this means is on average, so if we say, let's say the U.S. is a population, there's sort of more genetic differences within that population than on average genetic differences between the U.S. and sort of different countries sort of around the globe, things along these lines. Okay, why does this make sense and why is this adaptive? Why is it better to have more variability within a given population than sort of would say sort of variability across?
Population is what's competing with one another. Other populations have no effect on another population's resources.
Yeah.
When they're far away from each other.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. That's a good way to think about it, Colin. Like now, sort of the world's getting very small, and now we've got populations impacting other people, right? But from an evolutionary standpoint, yeah, like I could care less what's going on over there. So that's not those aren't the folks who are competing for resources. So yeah, excellent point. What else? Why else is it good for there to be genetic variability within a population?
Well, if everyone's like the same, and a disease came and kind of just wiped out like one person who got sick, it could wipe us all out.
Exactly. Okay. It helps for a robust population. Excellent work, Ramon. Yeah. And we think about this, right? Like, so we sort of look, there are outside differences that sort of make people sort of very clearly from different parts of the world and things along those lines, right? But if COVID comes through, and it's sort of impacting me, the likelihood it's going to impact someone sort of on the other side of the globe is probably pretty good, right? It's not like, East Asians are immune to COVID and white Europeans aren't, right? If it's going to come through and it's going to get someone, it's going to sort of get it at everybody. So again, seeing genetic differences across different populations not such a big thing. But like Ramon said, if let's say I'm super vulnerable to COVID, and if I get COVID, I'm going to die, right? If I'm the same as everybody else, that means if I'm going to die, everybody else is going to die, and then the whole population is wiped out, right? But if we have a pandemic come through, and maybe even most of us are susceptible to it, but some of us aren't, it helps from the whole thing being wiped out, all right? And so again, anybody have purebred animals? Dogs, cats, anything like that?
Isn't that really bad for them, though?
Yeah, it is, Kevin. It's real bad for them. If you have purebred animals, right, what you know is that they're really, really vulnerable for different types of illness. They're not really robust animals, okay? So I grew up on a ranch in the middle of, or not ranch, it's farm, in the middle of Wyoming. And so like all our dogs were mutts, right? And they're just sort of outside sort of dogs, and like they're a mix of all sorts of things. But like Superman dogs, they're robust. They don't get sick. They're just sort of pretty robust animals, right? If I've got this is my buddy's pug celebrating the 4th of July. All sorts of stuff go on, right? Sort of all sorts of genetic issues, health issues, and things like that, because these are animals that have been bred to have certain characteristics, and they've been inbred to the point that sort of they're all the same, or they all have the same features and things like that. But what ends up happening then is it starts to become a weak. You lessen the genetic variability, and you get animals that start to have problems. That's why inbreeding is not good, right? There's not a lot of genetic variability there, okay? So again, we see that these differences mostly within the population, very good for keeping a robust population or set of organisms, right? If something comes through, it might get one of us, but it's not going to get any or all of us. Helps with some of this development of adaptive traits, but we do see commonalities across the human species, right? And from an evolutionary psychology standpoint, these are things that we generally assume have some sort of adaptive value, okay? So we see emotions, right? There's no community there's no population of humans in large that don't experience emotion. Everybody experiences emotion. Now, the extent to which we express emotion might differ, but emotion is a human universal. Why is emotion good? Like, what does emotion help us do?
Good for communication across each other, as well as for mating.
What? One more time, Cade. What did you say?
It is used for communication between each other as well as for mating.
Yeah. Think about this, if you've got friends, and people probably do, maybe you're this person, right? I'm kind of flat. I don't sort of actually express emotion a whole lot, right? It's hard to interact with folks sometimes because I can't read them. I don't know what's going on with you. I don't know how to respond to you at any given point in time, right? Probably for finding mates too. I don't know if anybody's super excited to sort of go on a date with a dead-eyed serial killer who's not expressing any emotion. That date's probably not going to go very well, right? So emotion is adaptive because it organizes behavior. It gives us sort of motivation, things along those lines. And so from an evolutionary psychology standpoint, we'd say these are the reasons why we have emotion, because it's sort of developed as a way to keep us safe, right? Fear is an excellent motivator. If I walk out in the woods and there's a bear pop out and I'm like, oh, a bear, I'm going to get munched, right? If I'm terrified and run the other way, that's helping me survive, right? So emotion. We also see phobias, right? Phobias are universal, and particularly certain types of phobias, snakes, heights, these types of things. Why are these adaptive?
I would say they're adaptive because if you were killed by a snake and you saw your buddy get killed by a snake, you would either know not to get killed by a snake, or you'd also get killed by a snake.
Yeah, exactly. Early on in our history, if I'm the guy who's screwing around on edges and I fall off, and everybody else is like, oh, well, I wonder what happened there, and just keep screwing around on edges, right? And so we start to identify these things that are kind of universals. And we see this in phobia uh, in closed places. Be like, oh, I like to wedge myself in tight places where I can suffocate. Well, if that's not a good thing to do. And so we start to develop these natural fears of these types of things. And again, an evolutionary psychology standpoint would say that's why we have some of these general themes in terms of things that people as snakes, spiders, insects, creepy crawlies, heights in closed places, things like that, right? And things like taste aversion, right? If I drink something or eat something and it makes me violently ill, it's probably good that I don't like that anymore because it's helping me sort of stay alive, right? So these are kind of the framework that an evolutionary psychologist is working from. Now, evolutionary psychology it gives us some interesting ideas about sort of how some of these universals, human universals, have developed, not without its limitations, okay? It's hard to run an experiment from an evolutionary psychology standpoint. I'm going to set up this population and follow it for 100,000 years and see what happens, right? A lot of it, we're starting with some universal and working backwards to try and understand and come up with hypotheses about why some things are, right? Which is an interesting thought experiment, but in terms of finding evidence for your hypotheses can start to become difficult. And this is where we get into issues with being able to test things directly. Remember that property of a good theory is the ability to make predictions and to be able to be testable. We have some problems with sort of the evolutionary psychology sort of framework being able to sort of get direct tests for certain hypotheses. And then there's just some stuff that are universals that are hard to account for from an evolutionary framework. Okay, suicide is one of them. Okay, people who die by suicide. This is a universal. It's happened as long, if we look back through writings and records, people have ended their own lives for as long as we can remember. Right now, if I'm taking an evolutionary perspective on this, it starts to become very hard to understand how dying by suicide helps perpetuate your genes and sort of continue on with things, right? Now, that's not to say evolutionary psychologists haven't come up with sort of explanations, right? But sometimes it's hard to know whether or not these are something that could be valid or maybe just things that are cute explanations for something that sort of is just not a good fit for this framework, right? And so some interesting areas, and so it's not evolutionary psychology is in a big area, but again, sort of builds into this idea of sort of genes and genetics and sort of how we've gone through and developed certain kind of universals. Some interesting work in some areas, but some limitations in others. Okay. Questions? Feeling good about this? Okay, cool. So we'll put that to rest here.
I
And
do have one question about epigenealogy or whatever.
epigenetics?
Yeah, epigenetics. Sorry.
Okay.
So can a lack of food also be a factor that changes or makes you express different genes? Like lack of resources, could that make you more aggressive because you need to be more aggressive?
Colin, it's a good question. Probably, it's a possibility. I would just say, and again, my wife works with kids. She's a school psychologist who works with kids with sort of behavioral issues and things along those lines. I don't know necessarily that you need to pull in genes, at least on a sort of at the individual level of that. If I have no food at home and I go to a classroom and you're seeing evidence of aggression in a kid, particularly during lunchtime, that's kind of raising questions about, is this a kid who's getting enough food at home, or when food's around, I have to fight for it. And so because I know that this is the only meal I'm going to get during the day, I would probably chalk that up more to just a straight up behavior learning issue. But over time, it could be right that I mean, an evolutionary psychologist might say that, yeah, that could be a process. I mean, I think if we're trying to explain specific behaviors we're seeing in people, I would probably say it's more sort of immediately probably linked to sort of immediate environment behavior as opposed to the expression of a gene. But it's possible. Yeah. Does that help? Cool. All right. Any other questions? I think, Colin, in terms of lack of resources and nutrition and things like that, I think sort of it could be I have this gene that could put me at risk for the combination of genes that could put me at risk for some sort of negative outcome, either sort of behaviorally, physically, something like that. But if I have adequate nutrition, then it's fine. So I have compensation around that. But if I don't, that could, so if I'm suffering from malnutrition or something like that, that could trip that sort of, or change the expression of certain genes, which then sort of chain reacts into something else. That's probably closer to how we would typically think about that situation. All right, cool. So going to do some developmental stuff. Real quick, prenatal development. This is, again, basic biology 101, probably not news to anybody. But if we're thinking about development of new humans, beginning with fertilization, sperm and egg come together, 23 chromosomes apiece, sort of bringing in sex chromosome provided by the sperm determines biological sex of the embryo. Embryonic period, fertilization to 8 weeks. Okay, for this, you don't have to worry about dates or things along those lines. Just kind of know these general sort of steps here. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time, but I'm not going to say, give me what happens at 24 days, so don't worry about that level of detail. But during the embryonic period, again, fertilization of about 8 weeks, we start to see a nervous system beginning to develop very, very early on, about 18 days post-fertilization. Brain and spinal cord start to differentiate about 24 days, okay? So we start to be able at the sort of biological level see the brain and the spinal cord start to separate or sort of become distinct from one another. And during this embryonic period, particularly sensitive to toxins, okay? So if I'm drinking heavily or using drugs or sort of putting other things into my body, exposures to lead and things like that, new embryo pretty sensitive to that. And then we've got fetal period, 8 weeks to birth, starting to see very early on some reactions, or fairly early on, some reactions to external stimuli. Again, we'll see a fetus start to become responsive to sound at about 6 months. But again, also continued exposure to toxins. Again, things like alcohol use. And this is, again, my wife has done worked on some work in Buffalo with this, looking at trying to identify some research impact of different toxins. Really kind of hard to see sort of what sort of tying together, like, sort of meth does this or so on and so forth. Cigarettes are really, obviously alcohol is really bad. We run the risk of fetal alcohol syndrome, but also cigarettes in terms of during pregnancy, putting people at risk for attention difficulties, a lot of other types of things going on. So we start to see risk for certain psychological issues, but then also things obviously like heavy alcohol use can start to result in physiological abnormalities and things like that. Okay. So early on, but even once children are born or before they're born, we know that, and again, I talked about this here, responsive to sound at 6 months, we see that these tiny organisms start to become, we have evidence of some level of mental processes occurring even prior to birth, before fetus is born here. And so how do we start to know from a research standpoint, what can we start to do? How do we know that mental processes are going on if we're talking about infants or neonates or sort of before they're born? How do we know? How do we see evidence of mental processes? Because I can't ask you. I can't be like, hey, baby, what are you thinking? And they're like, oh, this is what I'm thinking, right? From a developmental standpoint, if I'm a developmental researcher or a developmental psychologist, how do I start to detect early on, even prior to birth, evidence of mental activities?
Try testing their reactions with using sounds.
Yep.
And see how they react.
Yep, exactly, right? Babies aren't much good at self-report, but they are pretty good at having reflexive reactions and things like that, right? And so what we do is we can start to see, based on these reflexive instinctive behaviors, right? Things like rooting, right? That's for, like, if I'm a baby sort of rooting around trying to find a nipple for food, for breastfeeding and things like that. Sucking, grasping, crying, orienting. What's orienting refer to? Michael. Oh, is he froze? That didn't work. Like, I was going to yell at somebody, but now the game is up, right? I say, Jaden. Oh, I saw you look at me, Jaden. You looked at your screen. Jaden oriented. She's trying to ignore me. But what we did is we saw an orientation there, right? So I said something that was relevant to Jaden, and Jaden looked up from her thing, right? Same thing with babies. If I go through and I snap over here, we're wired to orient towards relevant, important stimulus, right? And so what we can do is we can start to do things even early on, before a child is born, to start to get evidence of behaviors, okay? And so what I might do as, what is that? Colin, would you, oh, what? Oh, okay, there we go. Cade went through and had said sort of playing noises or sort of loud things or something like that. What we start to see is 2 months before birth, right? What we can see, if I start to play a noise sort of on sort of one side of the mother's side or something like that, you see infants sort of like start to orient towards stuff. But if I keep playing the same noise again and again and again and again, they'll stop orienting. Okay, why would they stop orienting if I keep playing the same noise over and over?
The stimulus becomes irrelevant.
Yep. Yeah. And what do we call that, Cade? You know?
I forgot.
It's habituation, right? This thing, if it's novel, I'm going to orient to it. But if it keeps happening again and again and again, it doesn't seem to have any information, I'm going to habituate to it and I'm not going to respond anymore, right? But all of this is evidence of a mental process, right? And so we see early on the ability to do this. So again, habituation to prenatal stimuli. What we see is young children, in terms of language development, crying with melodic similarities to mother's native language. And so if I'm a developmental psychologist and I work specifically with language, right, what they've been able to do is look at specific phonemes that occur in sort of, if I record an infant's crying, right, and I look at some of the sound, the inflectuations and stuff like that that's going on in that crying, there are connections that are more similar to mother's native language than sort of maybe a baby born to a mother from sort of a different language or culture or things along those lines, right? So early on, seeing evidence that even prenatal stuff, right, even before the child is born, sort of picking up, sort of starting to process language-specific sounds, right? Basically, I'm crying in German or Spanish or Chinese or Korean or things along those lines, right? So some cool stuff there. We also see orientation to face and head. Very early on, we're hardwired, and we can see this in infants. If I show a picture of a cat, and I show a picture of dog, picture cat, dog, cat, dog, but then I go through and I trick the baby. If I go through and put a cat dog or a cat head on a dog body, they'll do a double take, right? Or if I put a dog head on a cat body, they'll do a double take, okay? Or let's say, all right, you guys, don't be too impressed by my use of Microsoft Paint here. That's high-tech stuff. All right, let's say I draw a picture It looks like that. And another one looks like that. Which one is a kid more likely to look at? Here's right. Here's left. Which one is a baby sort of most likely to orient to or focus on?
I think left
Yeah, why do you say left?
looks more similar to a face.
Yeah, right. And this is what we see. Children will prefer and spend more time looking at this because these have basic features of face-like stuff going on, right? And so very early on, we start to see uh, types of behaviors that suggest, even if we can't sort of ask the baby or the infants directly, that there's stuff going on. We also see production of language-specific phonemes, again, not only in crying, but also in the babbling, right? I will sort of babble and sort of make noises that start to replicate specific. Anybody know what a phoneme? Do I have any speech language folks in here?
Yeah, a phoneme is basically just any individual sound that either does or doesn't have meaning.
Okay, yes, absolutely. Hannah, was that you?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, exactly what Hannah said. It's sort of the basic unit of sound and language, right? And so phonemes in English have different sort of characteristics than, say, phonemes in Japanese, right? If anybody's tried to learn a different language and you're trying to produce like words, it can be hard. Because like that's not a sound that we have in the English language if English is your native language. But at very, very young age, there's windows for language development that are able to pick up some of this stuff. So again, early on, seeing evidence of cognitive development and stuff going on. Okay, so going to finish up here real quick. Physical development in infants, what we start to see. Obviously, the child is growing. We can see physically they're getting bigger, but in their brain, we see neural development. Basically, babies are born with the brain, and there's still a lot of stuff that needs to go on, right? And that stuff will continue to go on for quite some time, right? Babies are born with an overabundance of neurons. There's more neurons, there's more connections there than that child will need, okay? And what we see as that child continues to develop, we see something called synaptic pruning. And what will happen is those connections that start to become important, that they use and are important for behavior, those connections will become stronger and stronger and easier to fire. Those connections that aren't used or sort of seem to be too important or not used as often, those will start to weaken off, right? And so what we see in young children is kind of the brain becoming more efficient as we continue on through development. And this is going to continue on through young adulthood, okay? I'm guessing most of you out there in the audience somewhere between 18 to 22. On the young end of that, like your brains are still developing and still becoming more efficient. There's portions of your frontal lobes still aren't sort of 100% cooked, right? So you are probably going to be more impulsive and make poor decisions that you wouldn't make if you're 40 like me, hopefully. Not to say I make all good decisions, but I have less of an excuse for impulsive garbage that I do as opposed to you all, because we start to see the continued brain development that will go through young adulthood as we continue to develop those things that we use and become important for cognition, behavior, all the things that we do in function start to become stronger. Those stuff that are less relevant sort of start to get sort of weakened off. Okay? And this is all sort of directed towards improving the efficiency of the system. All right. We'll leave it at that. We'll pick up with motor development next time.
I have a quick question about I guess like stem cells or like neuron cells that don't have real functions yet.
Yeah.
When they don't have real functions yet, like how long do they stay around? Like what age is the point to where we don't have any more stem cells that are just like floating around?
I don't.
Is it like puberty is where it's like we kind of have our brain's functions already figured out, or or is it way later than that?
So I think the synaptic sort of is your brain sort of becoming more efficient. I think that's going to be a separate. It's going to be a separate issue than stem cells. I think. Heidi, are you anywhere out there? No, not out there. I can go through and take a look at that, Colin. I think the stem cell issue is maybe not going to be directly relevant to sort of the synaptic pruning and the neural development. Now, what I will say is that one of the things when we're talking and thinking about like things like head injury and stuff like that, if I had to choose between, say, getting a pretty intense head injury at 16 versus at 40, 16 is probably the better bet, right? Because again, we still have sort of, we're thinking about prognosis and things like that. There's still some of this neurogenesis types of stuff and increasing plasticity as your brain is continuing to sort of get itself formed and baked and stuff like that, that lends itself to being a little bit more, like head injuries are no good at any point in time. That's to say, if I get a head injury at 16, that couldn't have serious impacts on my functioning for the rest of my life. But in terms of a prognosis type of thing, there's a little bit more wiggle room and a bit just in terms of just healing and stuff like that is easier to do when you're younger than it is when you're older. I don't know that has to do with stem cells per se, just as more so as it just a state of your brain, because it's developing and things along those lines. It's just a little bit more malleable in terms of redirecting things and being flexible than sort of once you sort of hit past emerging adulthood and things start to get set in a little bit more solid with that. But I'll go through and see if I can catch anything on that. Other questions?
Dr. Clapp, I have one.
Yeah.
So, regarding children that are like, say, born to other mothers and then adopted into other families, but the original mother spoke a different language.
Yeah.
So, like, an American family adopts a Chinese baby.
Sure.
They've been around the Chinese around Mandarin for all the time of their life. Is there a notice is there like a big difference in like them picking up the new language that they're going to be in, or like development at all?
No, I don't think so. A couple of things that happen though that's really interesting. What we see is, again, language is one of those things that's super hard to acquire sort of once you're sort of past. So think about like I'm a professor. I've always been sort of school's cool. I'm sort of smart. I can do sort of stuff like that. So pick things up pretty easy. Language is hard. Like I've never been good. I'm aggressively unilingual. And so like over this course of the pandemic, I've been on Duolingo. I'm trying to pick up Spanish and stuff like that. And I'm sort of getting better at it and things like that. But what we see is sort of an early language window where people are sort of much, much better to pick things up. So to your point, if I am an American family and I adopt a baby from China who's been, and let's say they're one, right? And they've sort of just been around Mandarin speaking, Mandarin's been the native language. That sort of window for language is still pretty good. They're probably going to be able to pick up sort of English, no problem at all, right? So I wouldn't expect any sort of delays going on there. What is interesting though, and what we'll see is, so I have sort of friends who are international faculty, and so and have wanted their children to be able to speak sort of native language, and so what they've done is only spoke they speak sort of English, right, and sort of went around because I don't understand Finnish, but only when they're talking to their daughters, just only speaking Finnish to their daughters, right? But still, daughters they speak Finnish, speak English, and translate back and forth between them sort of very, very easily, right? Now, when kids who grew up in bilingual households go into like elementary school, sometimes you see a temporary bit of a delay in terms of sort of picking things up in terms of reading and language. which makes some sense because I'm trying to navigate 2 while everybody else is trying to navigate 1. But what we see is over the long term, much more flexibility and sort of greater lingual ability for kids who grow up in bilingual households sort of down the road. And so early on, what might look like a deficit or sort of some slow progress in sort of reading or some of the stuff that we do in school, but that's temporary, and after, so you hit a point and then it just shoots up, right? And so this is why sort of the arguments for some of the dual immersion language programs and things like that is because it's hard sort of on the front end, but the gains you see afterwards are sort of pretty clear in terms of the research. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So you got that kind of that big window from infancy to it's like 5 or 6 or something like that. And then sort of picking things up after that, if you haven't been exposed, starts to get more difficult.
You broke up in that last sentence. Could you repeat that?
Oh, yeah. I said from like infancy to about 5-ish, kind of that window. But then if I'm trying to pick up a new language after that, it starts to get more difficult.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Other questions? Feeling pretty good? All right, folks, cool. So, yep, jump in, make sure that you're reading stuff early, taking notes. Let me know if you're running any questions. Keep your eye on research stuff. Again, pre-screen ended last night at 9, so people are going to go through, have that out. So people are going to start putting up studies. There's probably going to be lots and lots of stuff that are available. So just keep an eye on that. Remember, you need 6, but you can go all the way up to 9. I'll credit you up to 9. If you're running any questions, probably best to contact the individual investigator who's listed on the study. Ask them whatever needs to come up. But if you have general issues, feel free to get in touch with me. I'll try and help you out with stuff. Okay? All right, folks. Good to see you. Enjoy your afternoon, and we will catch you on Wednesday. All right. Bye.
Have a good one.
Will do. Thank you.